Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Halftime Talk feature interview series. And I'm delighted today to be joined by the Right Honourary Professor Charles Hendry, a former Minister of State for Energy for the United Kingdom. Professor Charles, thanks so much for joining us today.
Diala, it's a great pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
Well, great to have you. And what an opportune time, really, given your extensive background, but particularly not just in energy, but in the whole geopolitical sphere. And there's no shortage of those waves, are there at the moment, hitting the energy markets. So let's start by asking you, a bigger picture question on, we've got a lot of geopolitical red flags, waving already in front of us for the year ahead. We've obviously had the war in Ukraine for 2 years, plus we now have these awful tensions in the Middle East as well, and in the Straits of Hormuz, etc. What would you identify as far as the energy sector is concerned, the biggest sort of flag, if you like, going forward for the next few quarters as we enter the second quarter of 2024?
So I think, Diala, it is primarily that uncertainty, and it's the risk and the danger which you've outlined already. I mean, I can't remember in my adult lifetime a time of such danger, and having a war in Europe and a war essentially in the Middle East and tensions in other parts of the world, that is undoubtedly going to put pressure on global economies and on global energy markets. We are expecting to see faster growth this year from China. America will probably grow quite well. Europe will probably be rather more sluggish, a little bit of picking up, but behind the United States for certain. But we have got an enormous amount of uncertainty which is out there, which is making it difficult for governments and is making it difficult for those who have to make investment decisions.
And I mean, you said that I just want to touch on the point you just made there about the growth outlook. Of course, the US has surprised many people last year by continuing to be quite strong, the sort of, higher for longer rates, which are still there, but the US economy is doing well. China is also doing all right. And would you say on the Chinese front, obviously as a huge consumer, that this year even the indications are they starting to look a bit more positive than people perhaps even thought 3 months ago?
I think so. I mean, from the evidence which we're reading about, then that would appear to be the case. Remember, of course, I mean, so much of China's manufacturing output has to come into Europe. It has to come through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. If there are problems there, then that could have an impact both on China's output this year and on European recovery. So that again, it's the geopolitical tensions which are going to cause so much of the risks for people this year.
Well, let's talk a bit about those choke points in the Red Sea, Bab el-Mandab, etc. I mean, that continues. We've seen a lot of shipping diverted from there, but the oil's still making its way, not just other trade, but oil specifically. I mean, do you think the energy markets have almost settled into that reality of longer voyages, but the geopolitical risk premium doesn't seem to be really raising its head, does it?
So it doesn't. And so there's a big difference, I think, between now and when the Suez Canal was physically blocked 2 years ago, and when at very short notice, then they had to find a route for all of the freight and all of the shipments to go right round Africa instead. And that caused a huge amount of chaos and unsettled the markets very significantly. This time, I think that they've been able to plan more capably for it. But then there are still high risks, so that for Europe, much of our gas comes in LNG from Qatar. If the Straits of Hormuz were to be blocked, if there are problems getting those shipments through the Suez Canal, then that would cause very quick disruption. So at the moment, this appears to be relatively calm. It appears to be factored in, but these are the sort of issues which could change very quickly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But of course, the shipping market and is adaptive, isn't it? Quite adaptive. I wanted just to touch on the Ukraine and Russia, and of course, Central Asia is a big part of your background as well, professionally speaking as well, from a trade point of view. But whether we get a lot of comments from our daily commentators who we speak to on our podcast programs as well, that and you see it and we all feel it, that there's a bit of fatigue in support for Ukraine on the street, if you like, in Europe and globally, but also, more importantly, the financial commitment and all that that's playing out. Do you think that the Western commitment to Ukraine is sustainable? I mean, it's still there, but how sustainable is it? Because this conflict doesn't seem to be going away, does it?
It doesn't. It looks like we're in there for quite a long haul now. And the European commitment, I think, is very strong in almost all countries in the EU and other countries like the UK. We've seen very strong statements from our Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, this week about the urgent need to provide more support, both financially and in terms of equipment, to Ukraine. The question mark is the United States and the impasse in which we're seeing in Congress at the moment. The refusal to sign off additional support, and then, of course, the risk of a Trump administration coming in and what that might mean. That adds to the sense of being a very unsettled world this year. But I think from a European perspective, we recognize that, look, we cannot have a war in Europe which succeeds and that where the aggressor wins, that we have to be very solidly behind Ukraine. We are. That commitment is absolute. And that you'll find in most of the European governments.
I mean, one question that's come up about the Ukraine-Russia war is that if and when it ends, however it may end, with Russia being more victorious or not, that from an energy supply point of view, will Europe go back to taking more Russian gas? Will Germany go back to its reliance on Russian gas, etc.? What's your opinion on that, given what Europe's done to adjust to that in the last 2 years?
I think there is no chance of Europe going back to the old days. I think if you look at what's happened, and what happened after the invasion was remarkable. The speed with which Germany managed to take itself entirely off Russian gas. In 100 days, it had opened floating LNG facilities. It was able to bring in gas from elsewhere. It was able to bring on other sources. And so that sort of movement was an extraordinary reaction. But at the end of the day, it had been a very serious political misjudgment for some European countries to allow themselves to be so heavily reliant on gas from a single source. And I think that lesson has been well and truly learned. And it's not now just about gas, it's about critical minerals going forward. It's about making sure for the things which are fundamental to our economic well-being, that we do not allow ourselves to be overly dependent on a single source. There's a Winston Churchill quote for absolutely everything. And over 100 years ago, he said, when it comes to energy security, the answer lies in diversity and diversity alone. Now, he was talking about diesel for the fleet, for the Navy in those times, but actually it's as true today as it was then, that we have to have more diverse routes. And I think it would be a very brave board of an energy company which said, when the war does come to an end, I've got a great idea, let's go back into Russia. That's not going to happen quickly. I think we're looking at a change which is going to last for decades in terms of attitudes towards Russia. That Europe is now trying to reduce its dependency on gas from all sources. It's what's happened in Ukraine has accelerated the move towards decarbonization. We're seeing that as a much more structured approach from European governments. So that there is a long-term shift which is now happening. And it will not go back ever to business as usual with Russia.
Professor Charles, I mean, you mentioned diversity in energy, in the energy sort of diversity in energy sources, and particularly gas when we're talking about Russia. But I mean, also let's talk a little bit about the new sort of world economic order that's taking shape. That we see, obviously the China-US trade spat, you've got, global South versus global North, etc. This move and shift to, onshoring, nearshoring, the argument that globalization has taken a hit since COVID, etc. How is that going to be impacting, do you think, countries' energy policies, both in Europe, we've just touched on that, but also, for example, US and Asia?
So I think we're going to see a more cautious approach in countries. I think that what we've seen has been countries have been caught short by the circumstances of Russia's invasion, and that they, as I was saying just now, that they're going to make sure that they're not as at risk in the future as they were on this occasion. I think other countries will have looked at that as well and said, well, okay, there's a lesson there for all of us. Over-reliance is a bad approach. I don't like the phrase global south. I think that it is a sort of a global north approach, and as if to suggest that all of the countries in the global south are homogenous, they act as one. And in fact, we've got to look at them as many, many different countries who are going to have their own energy policies, their own energy needs, their challenges, and they need to be looked at individually rather than assuming we can treat them all collectively. But I think one thing which is very clearly happening now is the growing influence of the Gulf countries, of the UAE, of Qatar, of Saudi Arabia, and of the measures which they're putting in place to become not just more significant in terms of their energy significance, but as geopolitical players. And if you look at the way in which the Emiratis hosted, I think, a very successful COP28 last year, then we can see that they're showing that they want to have a different role in the global economy than they've had in the past. I think that's to be welcomed, actually. I think that countries like the UAE, like Saudi, can have a different dialogue, often with countries which are emerging, often which have got a complicated relationship and history with the UK and with Europe and the US, and therefore having the ability to bring them in a more constructive way, I think is going to be good.
Let's talk a bit about the energy transition, because another thing the Gulf countries have been leading on is, as major, obviously, energy producers, they've also taken the lead in investing in new energy and greener energy, their projects in hydrogen, etc. But at the same time, we had Saudi Aramco a couple of weeks ago saying that the energy transition is visibly failing, quote unquote. Would you agree with that, in the sense that has it taken a little bit of a downturn the last 2-3 years as the subject of energy security has become more sensitive? And what do you make of those comments from a Gulf producer point of view?
Yeah. I think that you have to look at it country by country or region by region. And if you look at Europe, then Europe undoubtedly is continuing to accelerate towards a net zero future. That we see that now as an integral part of our energy security, that the less we have to be dependent on imported fuel stocks, then the more secure we're going to be. So from a European perspective, we will continue to see the accelerating move towards that. The United Kingdom now, first major country in the world to have reduced its carbon emissions by over 50%. And at the same time as we've done that, we've managed to grow the economy by 70%. So that we have found a model whereby we can continue to see good economic growth, but we can decarbonize at the same time. Now, other countries are going to be in a different situation. That I think we will continue, as the International Energy Agency says, to see oil and gas and indeed some coal as an important part of the energy mix right the way through to 2050. And as John Kerry has said, that you've either got to stop using the hydrocarbons or you've got to capture the emissions. There is no other way of dealing with it. And I think what we are seeing in terms of some of the leadership in the Gulf and in other countries around the world on carbon capture, on hydrogen, in some of those areas, is saying, look, that if we are going to continue to use the hydrocarbons, then we do have to find ways of dealing with the emissions. So that the world, I think, is making better progress than many people had thought likely towards net zero and towards its decarbonization agendas. And when you start to see the billions now, billions upon billions being invested, not just by the energy companies, but by other companies, the tech companies, by governments, by the financial institutions in lower carbon solutions, then it is, I think, only going to move in one direction.
And do you think that's happening fast enough? I mean, of course, one of the things that OPEC, not OPEC, the COP28 meeting called for was, many things, methane reduction, etc. It addressed the question of fossil fuels, obviously, but it also did say that we need that expenditure to sort of be bigger. We need that commitment to emerging economies to help them clean up their transition journey, if you like. Did you see a firmer commitment come out of COP28?
So we're moving faster, but it's not fast enough. And I thought what we saw at COP28 was a significant shift in the right direction. I think the UAE COP28 presidency and Dr. Sultan personally took a significant risk in saying, let's include the oil and gas companies. And there was a risk of it being held in a petrostate. But at the end of the day, the outcome had to show that it would deliver more than would have happened had those oil and gas companies not been there. The loss and damage announcement on day one started to set the tone. Instead of being something which they would be wrangling about throughout the 10 days of COP, this was sorted out on day one. Day two, day three, we saw the methane announcement, going further than most people had thought was possible, and getting the engagement from the major IOCs to cutting significantly their methane emissions, a huge gain in terms of the climate. And so some of the outcomes which we saw from COP28 were beyond what people might have hoped for. Now, a lot of the focus at the end was about phase out or phase down. They found another sort of form of words which managed to keep people together. But realistically, I don't think any other country could have got a better outcome than the UAE secured at COP28. And it was not just a very good piece of diplomacy, but it was a very, very skilled piece of negotiation, which Dr. Sultan and his colleagues led.
Yeah, absolutely. And to the final hour, if you like, there was quite a bit of negotiation there as well, interestingly. But I mean, also, and as you said, they included the energy sector, which made all the difference, didn't it? It can contrast the Glasgow meeting, for example, or even Sharm el-Sheikh. But there has been a bit of a move by European oil majors, some of them the likes of Shell, etc., and even BP, in the last year or two, not retracting, but sort of becoming a little bit less enthusiastic, let's say, about their own sort of transition journey and their commitment to oil and gas conventionals. Do you think that's purely a sort of shareholder argument, if you like, financial argument, or do they see that genuinely the demand for oil and gas is stronger than we in fact anticipated it might end up continuing to be?
So I think in some ways it's regrettable. But I think there has undoubtedly been shareholder pressure. And if you look over recent years at what's happened to the Exxon share price compared to the Shell and particularly the BP share price, then there has been pressure for them to move back more into the hydrocarbon space. But they will be investing billions still into low carbon technologies. I think we should draw a distinction between areas where we can accelerate the transition by having the oil and gas companies involved and the areas where they don't need to be involved. So, for example, for land-based solar, you don't need the oil and gas companies. There are plenty of other companies which can do those investments and make them very successfully. But if you want offshore wind, or if you want carbon capture, and if you want hydrogen, then the skills which the oil and gas companies have and the financial heft which they can bring mean that we can develop those technologies more rapidly. So I think that, to me, this is about pace. How can we deliver the most rapid movement on climate change? And can the oil and gas companies play a useful role? In some areas, absolutely, they can help to accelerate it. In some areas, they're not needed to do so. And so if they focus perhaps more on the areas where their skills are absolutely essential, and then they can leave some of the other areas to others to take forward, then I think that is an acceptable outcome.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about that sort of skill set, if you like, the natural transition of skills that can be used that sector already has in its place, and leave the others to the more sort of maybe new technology companies, as you mentioned. Let's talk a little bit, Professor Charles, about the US and US energy policy. You mentioned earlier, of course, we have an election also coming up later this year. And you have the whole IRA Act in America that has been very strong success, if you like, on clean energy technology investment and incentives there. A good success. What's the main difference you would identify we would get from America in terms of its domestic energy policy and outward looking between a Biden and Trump presidency? Would there be a huge difference?
So I think the power of President Trump, if he was to have a second term, would be diminished in terms of what he could do in this regard, because so many of the decisions about sort of decarbonisation policies are led at the state level, or they're led by companies, which are the large international companies buy into the climate change agenda, even if President Trump doesn't. They're driven by Wall Street and by insurance companies. And so a lot of the investment which is required will still be driven by forces which he cannot directly control. When he came in for the first time, he talked about some boosts for the coal sector. But in fact, we still saw coal plants closing under his administration. Now, in terms of where it puts America on the world, I think then it shifts that very significantly. And instead of having a White House and a president which is leading the world, and the Inflation Reduction Act is an act of immense global leadership, then I think we would find that the America would pull back from some of those discussions. It certainly wouldn't be leading in the same way, and that will have a knock-on effect to other countries as well. The Inflation Reduction Act, I find it slightly amusing in a way, because for a few years, people have been saying to America, come on, you've got to do more, you've got to push harder. Then they come up with the Inflation Reduction Act, and people say, oh, no, come on, that's not fair, you mustn't do that.
Yes.
But actually, the solution is this is not Europe versus America versus Asia. We all need to be working together in the same direction. And so that if we want to see that progress happening, then we have to, in Europe, and we have to look at the Inflation Reduction Act and say, okay, how do we emulate it? How do we take forward some of that ourselves? And you've got some very strong leadership in the US in these sectors. In the White House, you've got people like Amos Hochstein, who's really helping to set the agenda. And I think that's something which benefits the world significantly. It's a sadness that John Kerry is stepping down. He's been a hugely important figure in this regard, and somebody who has made a massive contribution.
Absolutely. He's really been flying that flag, hasn't he? And really pushing that agenda as much as he can against all odds at times. The other thing that we are likely to see a difference on, obviously, between Trump and Biden, a Trump and Biden presidency, is on the policy of the US on sanctions, just switching sort of away from the transition back to sort of how that might be impacting, conventional energy flows, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Russia, whether it's Iranian oil. We've seen that the Biden administration, because it's been busy with other things and has had other priorities in terms of oil price, take a bit of a looser approach, if you like, to allowing, first of all, the Venezuelan reprieve, 6-month reprieve, which is up for renewal, I believe, imminently. But even on the Iranian front, letting Iranian oil flow a bit more loosely, for their own reasons, let's say, for their own, I suppose, selfish reasons in terms of having enough supply in the market. Do you think we'll see a big change in that if we get a Trump presidency?
Well, I suppose the difference I see is one of rationality, and that we can see why the Biden administration have made the decisions they've made. You can see the thought process which goes into them, and so that there is a degree of predictability in most of the things which they do. Clearly, they have to respond sometimes very quickly to big external pressures and shocks, and therefore, but you understand where their instincts are going to be, and you can therefore significantly factor those in. The risk, I think, of a Trump administration is that a policy will be changed at 3 o'clock in the morning by a tweet, and that it will not have been discussed with his advisors in the way that one might have expected. He won't have discussed it with America's natural allies, and therefore it's the uncertainty and the unpredictability which I think brings risks.
And how concerning is that unpredictability, the possibility of having that in a few months' time? How concerning is it today to the likes of the UK, Europe, or even here where I'm sitting in the Gulf? You could argue that here that there's a sort of pro-Trump slant sometimes as well. But is it a big concern, do you think, for global leaders today that we might get that?
Well, I think we look at the things which he says. They're not always consistent, but they do give grounds for concern. And his attitude towards NATO, his attitude towards Russia, are issues where there is profound anxiety in Europe about the consequences of what that means. If somebody works in a very rational, thoughtful, engaged way, then it makes it much more straightforward for being able to accommodate very significant policy differences. European governments have been very expert at working where there are very significant political differences, but where they work constructively and collaboratively. And if America ceases to work in that way, then that brings all sorts of risks and challenges to us, for sure.
And Professor Charles, just one last question, and I'm not asking you to get your crystal ball out, but in terms of the sort of volatility we've seen in the oil markets in the last 2-3 years, we had COVID, of course, and what that did to supply chain, etc., and to demand, to global demand, and then of course we've had the recovery from COVID, etc., cost of living crisis in Europe in terms of gas prices, and now in the last year or two, a reprieve from that as we've seen those gas prices drop. So from taking that all in, inflationary concerns, do you see the energy price equation a big challenge going forward, or do you, as many people on our show, say that the only way is up for oil because it's relatively cheap today compared to other consumer goods? Where do you see the direction of travel for energy prices in general over the next year or two?
I think it will be gradually up, and there will be obviously blips along that journey. But I think what we're going to see is that in quite a few countries, some of the more marginal developments won't take place because people don't know what the long-term future is for those sectors. So, for example, in the North Sea, we may see a drop in investment because people haven't got clarity and certainty. But there are still very big finds being found and developed in many other parts of the world. So I do think that we will see a gradual increase in the price. But then, as you say, I don't have a crystal ball. I think politicians, and I'm a recovering politician, we have to be very careful about making those sort of predictions. But it's not just about demand. It's clearly there's two sides to this equation, and supply can be flexed to either meet new demand or it can be contracted, so that the producers have a vested interest in keeping the price higher than perhaps it is today.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And of course, we've seen those equations play out a lot, haven't we? I mean, the demand side of the equation is still, we've got the IEA and EIA and OPEC sort of disagreeing by quite a few 100,000 barrels on demand growth. And then on the obviously on the supply side, the non-OPEC supply, of course, is a concern for OPEC plus. That is now coming around thick and fast. Right Honorary Professor Charles Hendry, thank you so much for joining us today on Halftime Talk. It's been a pleasure to get your insights.
Thank you so much. I've very much enjoyed it. Thank you.